Welcome to 2M History class, where the tides of time move slowly and the echoes of the past whisper softly. Tonight, we drift out to sea, not to chase adventure or chart new lands, but to sink gently into a darker chapter of human history, one marked not by triumph but by suffering, not by discovery but by endurance. Together, we'll trace the journey of the transatlantic slave ships, those quiet drifting tombs that once crossed oceans with terrible purpose. But you need not brace yourself. This is not a tale told in shouts or horror. It is quiet, steady, distant, like watching storm clouds over calm water. You'll find no cries here, only the low rhythm of oars, the creak of damp wood, and the slow passage of time. So lie back, settle in, and let us begin. Segment 1, the 9-week nightmare below deck, chained in darkness, disease, and the smell of death. The dancing slaves forced to exercise for buyers. Imagine yourself on a ship in the mid-1700s. The hull beneath your feet is made of coarse oak, stained with seawater and time. Above, a tangle of sails stretches toward a sun you can barely remember. And below, down in the bowels of the ship, it is night without stars. This is not the upper deck where wind and salt fill the air. This is the lower hold, where over 100 bodies lie pressed against each other like books on a crowded shelf. There is no space to turn, no air that does not carry the heavy scent of waste and rot. It is hot, oppressively so. The ship has crossed the equator, where the sea breathes warmth and the sun glares without mercy. There are no windows below deck, only tiny slits above, barely large enough to let in the light or the wind or hope. The journey across the Atlantic, from the coasts of West Africa to the markets of the Americas, lasted on average 6 to 9 weeks, though many voyages stretched longer. To the captives chained below deck, time passed not in days, but in rhythms, the scrape of the deckhand's boots, the slosh of the waste buckets, the call to dance. The stance was not joy. It was exercise. Each morning, those who could still move were hauled, sometimes forcibly, to the deck. Their limbs stiff from irons, their bodies brittle from dehydration, they were made to jump, sway, stretch. Drums beat slowly, like the distant pulse of obligation. The ship's crew insisted it was for their health. In truth, it was to keep them sailable, to ensure that when the ship docked, they did not appear too near death to be worth the price. To the enslaved, this ritual was a cruel pantomime. The chains remained on. Their eyes squinted against the unfamiliar sunlight, and many collapsed where they stood. Those who resisted were flogged, though we will not linger there. Just know that the rhythm of pain was as regular as the tide. The daily routine was grimly simple. At sunrise, the ship stirred. Food, if it can be called, that was doled out. A mixture of beans, cornmeal, or spoiled rice, spooned without care. Water was rationed, often brackish from poor storage. Illness spread easily in such conditions: dysentery, smallpox, scurvy. And those who succumbed did so quietly, sinking into stillness while surrounded by the living. When a body no longer moved, it was carried topside and dropped into the sea. No ceremony, no name. The ocean, already crowded with secrets, took another without protest. Night brought little relief. Sleep came not in peace, but in short fits interrupted by coughing, by nightmares, by the never-ending ache of metal against bone. The smell of vomit and feces lingered. Even the wood began to sweat salt from the sea, and mildew curled in the corners of the planks. For the ship's crew, conditions were better, but not comfortable. Sailors slept above, in hammocks or narrow bunks, plagued by lice and rats, but free to stretch, to breathe. Many were forced into service themselves, young, poor, desperate. They drank heavily to forget. Still, they were not chained, and they had power, if only over those with none. For the captives, the voyage was not just physical. It was a crossing between worlds of language, of faith, of everything known and everything terrifyingly unknown. Mothers were separated from children. Men were shackled apart from their clans. Names were lost, identities blurred, and yet, through the darkness they sang. Quietly, softly, when the crew was asleep or too drunk to care, they hummed melodies remembered from the coastlines of Sierra Leone, Benin, Angola. Songs of rivers and rains of gods who watched from distant skies. These were lullabies not of rest, but of resistance. The ocean heard them. So too did the wood of the ship, which soaked in their sorrow like water. As the weeks dragged on and the coastlines of the New World drew closer, many had died. Some had chosen the sea leaping from the deck in silence, believing that the afterlife lay beneath the waves, not beyond the plantations. Others endured. Their journey was not over, only changing. And so, as the ship finally neared land, preparations began. The captives were washed quickly, roughly with seawater. Their wounds were hidden, their bodies oiled to make them seem healthier. Some were even fed sweetened liquor to mask the taste of starvation, and then, when the ship docked, they were led ashore. Not as survivors, but as cargo. The first part of the nightmare had ended. A new one was about to begin. Segment 2, the slave who allayed a revolt at sea and won, the Amistad Rebellion, how captives fought back. The trial that shocked America. Let us now drift forward to a ship not unlike the others. But this vessel, though it carried chains, would not reach its intended shore. It is the year 1839. The ship is called La Amistad, a Spanish schooner, modest in size, sailing quietly off the coast of Cuba. The sun rests low in the sky, filtered through a thin haze. The sea is calm, almost lazy. The sails flap gently, like the slow breathing of something asleep. On board, 53 captives. Mende people, torn from the interior of what is now Sierra Leone. They had already survived one voyage from Africa to Havana, and now they were being sent along the coast for resale. The traders thought of them as cargo, as property, as silence. But among the captives was a man named Sengba P. You might know him by another name, Sinka. He was tall, quiet, observant. A rice farmer once, a husband, a father, a man who had spoken with the river winds and watched the stars over jungle canopies. Now he was bound by iron, but his spirit was unbroken. The journey began uneventfully. The Amistad sailed slowly, hugging the Cuban coastline. The crew of Spaniards grew careless. They had no fear. Their world had told them the men below deck had no will of their own. They were wrong. On the night of July 1st, as the ship rocked gently in moonlight, the captives struck. Using a loose nail and cunning patience, they freed themselves from the shackles. Then quietly, methodically, they moved. In the stillness, the cook was the first to fall. Then the captain. But it was not a slaughter. Sink stopped the killing when the ship was theirs. 2 Spaniards were left alive. To help sell the vessel, they had a single demand: take us home to Africa. But of course, that is not what happened. The surviving crew deceived them. By day, they steered east, and at night, they veered north. The ship wandered for weeks, like a ghost caught between continents. Rain fell, the sails withered, provisions ran low. The sea, once a path, became a trap. Finally, they were spotted. An American Navy vessel, the USS Washington, intercepted the Amistad near Long Island, New York. The ship was boarded. The captives, silent, barefoot, bewildered, were seized once more, shackled again, transported to Connecticut, and so began the trial. It was unlike any America had seen. The ship's owners claimed the captives were their rightful property, that they had purchased them in Havana and intended to sell them in good faith. Spanish diplomats demanded their return. President Martin Van Buren, anxious not to upset Spain or slaveholding states, leaned toward compliance. But others saw something different. A group of abolitionists rallied to the captives' cause. They argued that the transatlantic slave trade had been illegal for decades, and that these men had been kidnapped in Africa, not born into bondage. Sink in broken English, and with the aid of interpreters, told his story. His hands gestured, his eyes spoke. He recalled the stormy night of rebellion, not with fury, but with solemn clarity. A man defending his right to live. The courtroom was quiet. The world watched. The case rose all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, and there, in 1841, the justices ruled. The captives were not property. They were free. The decision rippled outward, unsettling the fragile balance of American politics. It emboldened the abolitionist movement. It infuriated slaveholders. But more than anything, it was a moment. A still point in the storm. After 2 years in custody, Sink and his companions sailed home, back across the ocean that had taken so much. Back to Sierra Leone, where only the familiar trees and rivers might still remember them. History would move on. The Civil War had not yet come. Slavery remained legal in half the nation, and yet, for a brief moment, justice had spoken, and it had listened to the voice of a man once chained, who dared to fight and live to return. Now, with the waves still beneath us, let us look not at what was above the water, but what now lies beneath. Segment 3. The sunken slave ships we'll never find, why most wrecks are gone forever, and what they tell us. The haunting artifacts recovered. Let us now descend beneath the waves. The surface of the ocean is always in motion, rippling, glinting, shifting with the wind, but below, where the light fades and silence stretches, the ocean becomes a vault, a resting place for stories too heavy to float. Among those lost stories are the ships, the slave ships. Thousands crossed the Atlantic during the long centuries of the transatlantic slave trade. Some estimates suggest over 36,000 voyages carried human cargo from Africa to the Americas. But of those many vessels, only a tiny fraction ever sank. And of those that did, fewer still have ever been found. You might think a sunken ship is easy to locate. Wood, iron, debris all resting on the seafloor like breadcrumbs of the past. But the Atlantic is vast. Its floor uneven, shrouded in silt, cluttered with centuries of wreckage from war and commerce and storm. Many of the slave ships that vanished were small, their timbers quickly claimed by worms and water. Some broke apart in hurricanes and were scattered across miles of sea. Others sank near shorelines that changed over time, swallowed by shifting sands or buried beneath coral. And yet, here and there, the ocean returns a piece, a timber, a shackle, a small bowl. These fragments whisper. In 2015, marine archaeologists announced the discovery of the Snow Jose Paquette to Africa, a Portuguese slave ship that sank off the coast of South Africa in 1794. It had departed from Mozambique, bound for Brazil. On board were over 400 enslaved men, women, and children. Only half survived the wreck. The rest still in chains, drowned in the surf, as waves pulled the broken hull back into the deep. For years, the wreckage lay untouched, just another shadow on the ocean floor. But with patient diving and careful research, archaeologists began to uncover its secrets. Iron ballast used to weigh down the ship, shackles, rusted and fused, and small personal items, beads, fragments of ceramics, tokens of lives once full and whole. They recovered little. But even little was enough. In another case, the Henrietta Marie, an English slave ship, went down near the Florida Keys around 1700. It had just completed its deadly triangle, England to Africa, Africa to the Caribbean, and now, empty of cargo, was heading home when it met its end. Divers exploring the wreck in the 1970s found over 80 pairs of shackles, still arranged in stacks ready for reuse. There were no human remains, only iron and silence. Why do we seek these ships? Not for treasure, not for gold or cannon, but for memory, for truth. The ocean is not sentimental, it keeps no monuments, and yet, with each wreck recovered, we learn more about the conditions of those voyages, the layout of the holds, the size of the spaces allotted to living flesh, the markings on the iron, denoting ownership, ports, nations complicit. Most slave ships will never be found. Some were deliberately destroyed. Others deteriorated so fully that nothing remains but vague anomalies on a sonar scan. And yet, historians and archaeologists continue their search, not in haste, but in reverence. Each discovery is treated with care, as if the sea itself is reluctant to give them up. There is something haunting about a sunken ship. The way it floats in memory, it lies so still in reality, like a forgotten verse in a song that still echoes. And so we return from the depths, from the muffled hush of the ocean floor, to the brightness above, to a world that lived off the pain these ships delivered. The world of estates, carriages, chandeliers, and justifications. Segment 4. The plantation owners who live like kings, the grotesque wealth built on suffering. How they justified slavery with science. Now we come ashore. The sea lies behind us, distant and still, while ahead stretch long, sun-drenched fields, neatly arranged rows of sugarcane, cotton, or tobacco swaying gently under a southern sky. The land is quiet, but it is a quiet born not of peace, but of control. At the center of these vast estates stands the house. Not just a home, but a symbol. Whitewashed walls, tall columns, wide porches draped in vines. A breeze stirs the curtains. Inside, the air is cooler filtered through shutters and high ceilings. The smell of polished wood, beeswax candles, and pipe tobacco lingers faintly in the parlor. This is the world of the planter elite. From the Caribbean to the Carolinas, these men, and sometimes women, presided over enormous tracts of land and unimaginable human suffering. They lived in a cocoon of gentility and wealth, shielded from the brutalities that sustained their comfort. Their days were measured not in toil, but in leisure. Breakfast served by quiet hands, business conducted from shaded verandas. Account books, letters, and long reflections scribbled in neat handwriting while enslaved children fanned the room. Guests arrived in carriages, evenings brought string music or sermons, or brandy shared beneath oil lamps. They thought of themselves as refined, as gentlemen, as caretakers of civilization, and yet, behind the house, out of sight were the quarters, rows of rough wooden cabins, one room each. Dirt floors, a single shelf, a shared fire. There, life followed a different rhythm, up before dawn. Fields worked from sunrise to sunset. Bodies strained under a punishing sun, driven by the overseer's commands. Children were born not into freedom, but into labor. Names were erased. Marriages were not legally recognized. Families were torn apart without notice. And still, the owners believed it was justified. How? Why? In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Enlightenment thinking spread and science took hold of the imagination, many plantation owners clung to a dark distortion of reason. They called it scientific racism. Using skull measurements, skin color charts, and deeply flawed logic, they claimed to prove what they had already decided to believe, that Africans were inferior, that they lacked reason, that they needed guidance. That bondage was, in its way, benevolent. Some even said it was biblical. Others compared their slaves to children, or beasts of burden, or tools. It was a web of lies, carefully spun, not just to maintain power, but to sleep at night, and sleep they did, in feather beds, under mosquito nets. attended by enslaved women who never had the luxury to rest themselves. Even their clothes spoke of the imbalance. Fine imported silks, embroidered vests, stiff collars, and polished boots, while the people who laundered and mended those garments went barefoot through the mud. The planters built libraries, universities, churches. They hosted dances, wrote essays, served in government. But all of it, every candlelit room, every manicured hedge, every golden candelabra, was paid for in pain, and back spent under cotton, and hands calloused by sugarcane, and voices silenced. And yet, even within this world of injustice, contradictions bloomed. Some enslaved people became skilled artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, midwives, essential to the very estates that kept them in chains. Some owners freed their children, born of enslaved women. Some enslaved people bought their freedom or ran or rebelled. History is never simple. It is not a line, but a tapestry interwoven with contradictions, choices, and silences. As time passed, the world shifted. Whispers became protests. Movements took shape. And one by one, the pillars of this brutal economy began to crack. But long after the plantations faded into history, their echoes remained in architecture and law and memory. Today, many of these grand homes still stand. Visitors walk the paths once trod by those in bondage. They marvel at the chandeliers, the mahogany, the staircases, and slowly, some begin to ask not who built them, but who paid for them, with their bodies, their names, their years. Now, as our journey draws to a close, let us leave this house. Let us walk once more through fields that have forgotten the sound of chains, past trees that have outlived their watchers, and toward the quiet peace of reflection. And now we return, not with haste, but with slow, careful steps back across oceans, out of the dim holds and dusty courtrooms, away from the drowned timbers and white-pillared halls. We have drifted through shadows tonight, not to chase sorrow, but to understand it, to touch softly the edge of a history written not in ink, but in lives lived under silence. The transatlantic slave trade was not a single story, but millions of them. Each voyage, each name, each broken chain a thread in a great tangled sea. We have walked among them in thought, felt the rhythm of their days, the weight of their nights. And in doing so, we remember. But now the sea is quiet again. The decks are empty, the sails are folded, and the wind has stilled. Let your mind drift like those long-lost ships into calmness. The world of the past is behind you. Ahead, only stillness. The soft hum of now, the comfort of your room, the gentle pulse of your own breath. You are not in a ship. You are not chained. You are here, safe, free. Let history fade like fog over water. Let sleep come quietly, kindly, as it once did, even to those with the heaviest burdens. Good night. You've been listening to immersive class, and now it is time to rest.